BCFM 93.2. Bristol is our community.
And now I'm joined by Richard Cottrell. Richard was an MEP, member of the European Parliament for the southwest of England. Hi, Richard, and welcome to Dialect.
Thank you for calling me on.
Now, you're just coming out with a book at the moment, aren't you, about Richard Beeching? Yeah. First of all, many people, particularly youngsters, haven't heard of this chap.
Well, this is hardly surprising, isn't it? Because you have to be of a certain generation, I think, where the mention of the words Dr. Beeching makes your blood run cold, because you'll have forgotten that there used to be a railway station in the town or the village where you live, which is now just a grassy embankment, where formerly happy and joyous people joined trains and went all over the UK, and indeed eventually one supposes all over the world. And Beeching, it was the mass murderer of branch lines and railway stations in the 1960s, who instigated a kind of, how can we put it, a holocaust of the railway system in the UK. This was not conducted, as the governments of those days pretended, in the interests of producing better value for money, cutting costs, rooting out subsidies, all the usual claptrap. It was about closing down the railways in order to drive people and lorries onto the roads in ever-increasing numbers to drive the new fantasy of the internal combustion engine revolution, which was supposed to bring happiness and fantasia and joy to all of us forever.
Well, so what was the motive, Richard? Sorry, I had to interrupt you, but what was the motive behind that? I mean, surely for most of us, we think, well, actually, the car was actually a more convenient technology that actually won fairly with the railways by superseding it, because people could actually drive from door to door with their car.
If that were true, which it's not, then it would rule today as the presiding rule. More people have cars today than ever before. More people have more than one car than ever before. Multi-car households are normal. So how do you explain then that railway passenger transport has now started to approach 2 billion passengers annually, which is a figure which has exceeded the last known peak, which was in 1948. So it isn't just about being able to go from door to door. Of course, the car offers special and extra conveniences in that fact. You don't catch a train to church on Sunday mornings or go to the pub, but you do use it for longer distance, medium-sized trips. It is necessary in many areas as an essential form of communication. So, in effect, you're repeating the old canard that Beeching and his crew came up with, which was, we don't need the railways anymore. We've got cars now, so we should close everything down except a skeletal network which will connect a few important cities with London.
What about the arguments that were put forward at the time? This is in 1963 for this. One of the main ones being that the railways simply weren't making any money. Another one being that it was actually difficult to connect. You know, trains would arrive at the main line station, and people would get off that train just to see a train disappearing off in the distance on the branch line.
Who was responsible for that, Tony? Ask yourself the question. This was part of the subliminal Beeching cuts. In order to cut the branches off the trunk, these failure of connections at important junctions and interchanges were deliberately arranged. It was very simple. That way you could stem the flow of traffic and direct it away from the main spinal system of the railway. It was quite specific. I studied it more or less at the time. But you asked a very important question just before that. You accused the railways of losing money. They were not. I prove in my book that from 1948 onwards, to the period where Beeching was installed as the Genghis Khan of the railways, they were in fact operating at a profit. The difficulty was that the governments of those times succeeded in an extraordinary sleight of hand. They forced the railways to borrow money from the Treasury at extortionate rates of interests in order to cover ordinary everyday expenses. This was a kind of repeat of the Danegeld of King Alfred's day, if you look at it in those terms. They also had another ruse up their sleeves, which was even more clever. They forced the railways to, and this is quite extraordinary, it could have happened in the Soviet Union, but it certainly happened in the UK. They forced the railways to back pay the government for building the railways in the first place, despite the fact that no railway had ever been built anywhere in the United Kingdom with public money. Quite uniquely, the British railway system was built entirely by private entrepreneurs. This was not the case in the continent.
What about freight, Richard? Because this is one of the things I think many people like me curse the amount of lorries on our roads today. Now, almost all of that freight used to be managed by the state. In fact, I think it was the British Transport Commission somehow, or British Road Services, had somehow sort of nationalised that. And actually, you could actually turn up even with a box of chickens at a railway station and get them shipped to anywhere in the country. I mean, surely that just wasn't practical to carry on like that.
Why? Why is it not practical? It's exactly what happens now, except that it's not done by the railways anymore. It's done by courier companies. The railway had an extremely good courier system. Years and years ago, several hundred years ago, I was a reporter on the Wellington Weekly News down in Somerset. And on printing day, which was Wednesday, I went down to the station at 7:23 in the morning in order to put a parcel, or envelope really, on board an early morning train from Wellington to Exeter St David, where it would be picked up by a representative of the Express and Echo Company, and then taken to the printing works, and the Wellington Weekly News would be printed on the basis of that important information which had been delivered. The railways had developed an almost seamless system of passing parcels, small objects, large objects, wagon-sized objects, capable of being delivered within hours or at best overnight. Now, this system was destroyed in order to pass the advantage away from public enterprise to private enterprise. Some people can still remember the Red Star parcel system, which British Rail used to run. It was brilliant, absolutely superb. This was broken up in order to benefit private courier companies. But you also have to remember that way into the 1960s, it was still possible for a single wagon to be picked up in a railway station, say 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, taken to the nearest hub, which could be anywhere you would care to name. Let's just choose a couple of places in the west of England, Taunton, Bridgewater, Gloucester, Cheltenham and so forth, put on an overnight link and delivered at the crack of dawn the following morning to the destination. This was a system which was seamless in transit. It had been working for years, working for the best part of 100 years, but it was all smashed to pieces in order to benefit the road transport lobby, which delivers at far greater costs, hugely greater costs, than the railways were accustomed to charging. The railways have to meet all their own charges. They have no way of getting out of the fact that they are responsible for all their own infrastructure charges, the track, signalling, railway stations, junctions, whatever. A road transport, a lorry, uses the roads free at the point of use from the perception of the owner and the driver. There is no serious levy on road transport which contributes to the cost of maintaining roads, building roads whatsoever.
Well, what about car tax?
All its own infrastructure costs.
Richard, what about car tax, for example, for lorries? Is much more than for cars, isn't it?
Tony, don't frighten me with demons at Christmas. Car tax contributes nothing. It used to be known as the road fund license. There is not a single person left alive anywhere in the civil service or anywhere in the political establishment who thinks that a single sou of road tax goes to building or maintaining roads. And even if it did, it would build about 100 yards, not more. Railways must pay everything themselves. Road transport has absolutely no serious charge levied upon it for using the roads. It's very simple. So you've got an unequal balance between two different forms of competition. It would be much better if it were coordinated together and both railways and roads worked together, as was postulated in the dying days of the private companies in 1947.
Now, just remind us of the title of your book, because it's actually all about the man Beeching himself, isn't it? And who exactly was he?
Well, wait a minute. It's not all about Beeching himself. what I've done is to try to open up the entire transport debate in the UK. And what I've said is that Dr. Beeching is a classic example of the dystopian ability of British transport planners to get absolutely everything wrong, given the chance. Starting with Beeching, going through to the Concorde, the aviation disasters, Crossrail, the long delays to building a motorway network in the UK, the last country in developed Europe to have a motorway system. All of these flow from the inability of transport planners and politicians to get a grasp of issues as distinct from the UK. As distinct from other countries such as France, Spain, Italy, even of all places, Sweden, all of whom have a much more dynamic and coordinated approach. But to ask me about Beeching, who was he? Most people think he was an accountant, a bean counter, but he was hired from Imperial Chemical Industries to run his bean counting measures over the British railway system, work out what was losing money, work out what was paying money, and then apply the axe. He wasn't an accountant at all. He was a physicist. And he was involved in the very early stages onwards in the development of what became the British A-bomb project. He was a brilliant physicist, actually, with a great specialist in metallurgy and tube alloys and blending alloys. And his significant contribution to the atom bomb project was to design the tube down which a projectile would be fired in early forms of atomic bombs in order to set off an atomic explosion. He was based at Fort Halstead in Ghent during the war. He ended up as deputy chief engineer in charge of that establishment. It was at that establishment that the atomic bomb project was hatched after the British were thrown out of the Manhattan project on the basis of loose lips sink ships. But he was never, ever an accountant. He was a physicist. And the way he came to the railways is very strange indeed. He came to the railways because most of his fellow physicists had connections in one way or another to Imperial Chemical Industries, which was the kernel, the nut and bolt of the British military imperial complex. And it was in that position that he made so many friends amongst scientists who gravitated to Imperial Chemical Industries or who came from there, who showered honours upon Dr. Beeching and raised him up to a director of Imperial Chemical Industries before the beginning of the railway adventure.